Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we have a great episode in store for you, all about imbalances. It's something that's come up recently in assessments. I think it's something that's poorly understood generally on the whole. So we're here to give you a few basic tips on how to understand them, how to identify them, and then what to do about them. But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check it out if you would like to learn more about movement mechanics. Wit-fitness.com. Please use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hydro, use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your blood flow restriction apparel. All right, Rob, imbalances. Tell us about your experiences there, please.
Mate, it depends what part of my life you want to go through to understand imbalances. I'll tell you what, if I break it down just into the training side of things, from my many training endeavors over the years, I've seen some clear strengths and weaknesses, imbalances, shall we say, on like biases towards certain things. Like, for instance, in my bodybuilding days, size of muscles differences, like my left chest not having as much of an outer sweep compared to my right, left bicep being smaller than my right bicep. Comes to performance, say where I might have over my bench press, my right side potentially locking out before my left side. When I was in my triathlon phase, as in the swimming, being able to open up on one side more than the other. So it's like, I've always identified these imbalances and I've tried to put things in place to kind of correct them to some degree. But big picture, most of the time, if it isn't causing me an actual issue, I've kind of just let it go because I'm not a pro athlete. I'm doing a lot of this for fun and to try and push myself. And until I guess I get an injury or something from it, that's then when it becomes a bit of a problem, which I would probably say probably do something before it turns into an injury. So, but what about yourself?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about it being very common, and actually it's not a problem until it's a problem, like we often say. And maybe, excuse me, maybe people will be surprised by me saying that asymmetry is not an issue. It's actually the norm. Like, everyone is asymmetrical, and we expect there to be differences from one side of the body to the other. One of the ways I like to explain this is that everyone has a dominant hand. We always prefer to do things on one side versus the other, whether it's writing or brushing our teeth. We're always, from a young age, biasing use of one side of the body versus the other. We're also uneven physiologically. Like, we have the heart to one side of the body, the right lung is bigger, the liver's on the right side of the body. So our organs sit asymmetrically. So why do we expect everything to work exactly the same, left versus right? It's never going to be the case. So it's totally normal, totally natural for you to experience left-right differences. However, as Rob said there, if these left-right differences go too far and we exacerbate the difference between one side and the other, it can eventually lead to issues. And we were saying this before we started recording, that it's actually the people that train the most that suffer with these to the greatest extent, because they're putting the most stress and strain on their body. So if there's a slight imbalance, especially if they do a lot of bilateral work, both limbs working at the same time, that strong side will do more work, which means it gets even stronger, and that imbalance can actually increase over time rather than stay the same or even out. So it very much depends on how far down the path you've gone in developing asymmetry as to whether it's an issue at all. But I think it's an important point to make at the start, is that just because things feel different on one side versus the other, or one side performs slightly different to the other, it doesn't mean it's necessarily an issue, unless it's holding back your performance or it is causing you niggles, pain, or injury. Then it's something you want to look at.
It's funny because you say how we are being asymmetrical and we always obviously strive for this symmetry, which just makes me think when things are symmetrical, they look weird. Your face looks weird when it's symmetrical. Anyone that uses both hands to write, they're weird. Because like, why the fuck can you use both hands? And people kick a ball with the left or the right. Why can you do this? It's like, this is not normal. It's like, it's funny that we strive for not normal, thinking that it's normal. It's a really weird like this pattern that we do things. It's just as you were saying it, and I was thinking about because I'm like Chloe's left-handed, but when babies are born, they can use both. Like they don't have necessarily a dominant hand. They kind of go into one, so they then have a favorite that obviously works better than the other one. But most kids come out using left and right for things because they haven't got the motor patterns necessarily to say right yet. It'd be like scribble with one hand, scribble with the other hand. So, but they're obviously that's their exploration phase of finding what hand does it feel better to scribble with compared to the other one. And same with kicking a ball, right? They just kind of run towards the ball and fall into it, and it's maybe one foot starts feeling a bit more normal. So it's just funny how we strive for this symmetrical balance across the body. And when you talk about like performance, instantly I then thought about a squat, and I just thought if my hips are different, as in like one slightly higher than the other, or slightly off center, or slightly rotated, squatting balance will do me no good. If I was squatting even on both legs because my hips aren't level. So if they were off, so I don't want to squat both. Obviously, if I could bring my hips to level, that's a different kettle of fish. But if I'm already off center, then my squat right to left ratio is going to be different. So it's a fascinating thought experiment.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. That in terms of maximal performance, so say you're going into a competition and you are imbalanced and you have compensations, you want those. You want to be using those to create the biggest output on that day. And that is a distinction from what's best long term. So say your right leg is providing 60% of your squat, your left leg's providing 40%. On the day, that's the optimal way for you to lift the biggest weight possible. It's basically, imagine a team, you've got good players and less good players. You want the good players to do more of the work than the less good ones. But chronically over time, if you repeat that, the 60% becomes 65%, becomes 70%, until eventually either the right leg gets overloaded or the one day you ask the left to do an actual 50% of the work, it gets overloaded. So there's a distinction between immediate performance versus longevity and optimal optimal mechanics. Like theoretically it's lovely to have 50-50, but in reality it's very rarely the case.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think once you start breaking down the human body, and like as you pointed out there with your organs being different, the fact that we don't have any control over that, yet this is what has happened and how we've evolved. That is, are we supposed to be like, we're not supposed to necessarily be barbell back squatting. That is not our answer. And this is like, for me, when I was playing around in the gym the other week and doing some like circus lifts, so like, doing like the Steinberg squat where you're kind of lifting weight up from the side and kind of like old strongman style movements, right? And like Turkish get-ups and like with a barbell, that sort of, so creating uneven loads and trying to move them. And like, if you talk about strength, like as a definition of strength, like for day to day, that's probably closer than a barbell back squat, a barbell bench press, and a barbell deadlift, which is then an extremely bilateral movement. Whereas when you got that type of movement, which is where there's obviously a big push at the moment towards like ancestral living, and through whether that's the way you eat, the way you train, the way you live day to day, your lifestyle, there's a lot of a push towards it. And it does make, when I tell you what, I finished that session and I felt fucking amazing. I felt so good afterwards, and I felt so switched on. Like my midline had never been so alert, and not in a bad way. I just felt my obliques, everything was just like, because I'd done so much anti-rotation, I'd done rotation, I'd done like, and it felt so good. But I was like, this probably isn't going to help me with my powerlifting competition. So it might do, but you know what? It's not worth the experiment now. But it's put what that has done and how good I felt there. Apart from when I was doing in the gym some jiu-jitsu, which was some wrestling essentially. That's a whole different conversation. But doing that like strongman training really lit a fire in me for once I'd done my competition to start going into that world a little bit more, because it just fascinated how good I felt. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because of the imbalances side of stuff. How I was picking something up from the complete one side of my body, and then doing the same on the other side. So yes, I'm trying to say balance it out, but I'm using I noticed how much of a different sequence I had to do on one side compared to the other side for the type of muscles that I could recruit. which are then where my imbalances come. So,
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a really good point that basically when you're doing unilateral or single side dominant exercises, there's less opportunity to compensate compared to the bilateral or barbell exercises where you're just working as a whole team. So if you do have one strong side, it will feel even for that strong side to do more of the work. So you can just crack on exacerbating the imbalance rather than ironing it out. Whereas when you do those single side dominant exercises, there isn't the opportunity to hide a weak side. And we're talking about this offline as well, where I assessed years ago now a power lifter, and I was just doing some basic balance testing. And on the one leg, he was like a ballerina. He was able to reach as far as he possibly could in any direction, perfectly stable, perfectly balanced, basically doing a pistol squat in 6 different directions. On the other leg, he shook like a leaf and nearly fell over as soon as his foot got away from his other foot, his reaching foot. And both of us were like astounded by the difference. I've still never seen anybody so different left versus right. But basically, all he did was squat, bench, and deadlift. He didn't do any accessory exercises. He worked an office job. So his body obviously had a side that was much stronger. And because he never exposed the weak side to much of a stimulus, it just got weaker and weaker in comparison and was never challenged in terms of strength or stability compared to the strong side. And to me, it just taught me a very clear lesson that unless you're regularly exposing your body to those unilateral stimuli, you run the risk of exacerbating any imbalance to quite. And he was obviously experiencing some pain. He had knee pain. Like you're almost asking for it if you don't get any exposure to the single leg side of things. So hopefully today we can give you a few practical pointers on how to identify those sorts of things, and then a few practical tips on what to do about it.
yeah, so we might as well jump straight into, especially like the left and right side of the body.
Yeah.
Mainly focusing on our limbs, so our arms and our legs. But there's going to be four main qualities that we can focus on. So we've obviously got strength and performance, mobility, stability, and the most important one, size.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start out with strength and performance, because I think, as we've been kind of alluding to here, when is it an issue? Because like that power lifter, the fact that he's bilaterally strong
Yeah.
as an ox, but then you put him on the single side, like he doesn't do that in his day-to-day competition. So for him, obviously the injury was obviously the main trigger. But is in like, when is that problem starting to come about?
Yeah, it's very much a grey area because he was hitting big numbers in his bilateral lifts until he got the injury. So we always talk about this in terms of resource allocation. Like, how much time do you want to take away from your core training to work on the less directly beneficial stuff? So we could think of unilateral stuff as less specific to the sport of powerlifting. And for each individual, there'll be a different blend of what's optimal. Like some people might make most progress on their barbell back squat by doing 80% unilateral work. Other people might make most progress by doing 80+% of just barbell back squatting. So it completely depends on your training history, injury history, and current situation as to what the right amount is. But I would say for most people, unless they're at the real top end of performance and all they care about is their powerlifting numbers, erring towards more unilateral stuff would be a safer option. You're just covering more bases and giving yourself a more rounded training stimulus for what the body actually likes. But the fundamental thing for all of these four movement qualities is we need to figure out a way to ascertain if they are an issue, because you might be perfectly balanced and then you don't have too much to worry about. So if we're going to look at strength and performance, the key thing here is to find a unilateral one-sided test where the other leg can't get involved. So if we're looking at squats, a great assessment I like to use for assessing strength in squatting would be a single leg floating step down. So basically stand at the top of a box, one leg hanging off the side, kind of like a pistol progression, and then just do a single leg squat. And the reason I prefer this to like a Bulgarian split squat or even a lunge for assessment is that the other leg can't help. It's literally just floating free in space. Whereas in a split squat or even a lunge, the amount of weight you put into that back leg is variable. So you can
Yeah.
actually hide a lot of strength asymmetry by leaning more into the back leg versus the front leg. So in that way, we get a clear comparison. Obviously, we can look at the number of reps they can do. We can load it up and see how much they can actually lift. Any of the normal strength variables we want to look at, we can assess in a setup like that.
Yeah, and I think as well with like the strength slash performance side of things is like the next 2 points of mobility and stability are gonna get involved here as well, because like the reason why, say for instance, you wouldn't use a pistol as an example of this is because you have too much requirement of good mobility and stability to
Yeah.
do a pistol. So then are you actually seeing something's true strength issue,
Mm.
or are you actually looking at more the mobility slash stability? And I think with the step down, the reason why I love that exercise as well is because you can kind of also then see the mobility of the ankle and the stability as well, and watching what's going on there to kind of also give you some telltale signs of what's going on up the chain. And
Yeah.
it does identify obviously with the strength side of stuff really clearly, but then it also, as I said there, does dive into the other areas. So mobility.
Yeah. Just before we get onto mobility, mate, let's cover off the watt bike.
Oh yeah,
So
of course. Yeah, sorry, yeah, my bad.
yeah, strength is obviously one component of performance, but there's also endurance and work capacity. And one of the great things that the watt bike offers is some real hard data on the contribution from
Yeah,
each limb. So if you are an endurance athlete rather than a strength athlete, you can see that one leg is over a long training session doing a majority of the work. So that's a real simple way to see which leg is providing more of your output than the other, if any. So if
yeah.
there's a massive difference there, that's definitely something you want to look at. It might be to do with your position, but obviously capacity in that leg will be a
Yeah,
factor.
I love the watt bikes. I'm glad you pulled me back to this, because it was like I remember going. We had some like watt bike training when I was at Virgin Active, so like just, what 8-9 years ago. So when they were
Mm.
like first coming out, kind of that type of time into like the commercial space, and being taught like about the peanut and stuff like that, and also and like the shape that you're producing. So like, are you pulling up through the when you're in trainers, you're not necessarily going to get the best shape anyway, for what the watt bike does, but for no one that knows what I'm talking about, essentially, what the watt bike screen shows is as you're pedaling, it's measuring the amount of power and pull. So push and pull you're doing through that cyclical motion. So through that range, are you pushing? Are you dragging? Are you pulling? Are you dragging? Essentially, so how much are you doing that on both sides? So not only does it give you a percentage on both legs, like how much is your left working, how much is your right working, but also how much push compared to pull, and it basically gives you like this little graph. So obviously you can game it, because if you can see the percentages and stuff like that, you can obviously be trying to keep that balance. But if you're trying to do a straight test of seeing, okay, you do like a 15-minute, 20-minute test of then covering the screen and just doing what you feel is best, as you say, it's a really good tool for especially like the endurance side as a way to identify some clear imbalances.
Yeah,
It's fascinating.
yeah, yeah, super cool, and something that we couldn't have done without technology very easily at all. So big fan of that as well.
So mobility.
Mobility, yeah. So as always, I'm going to promote specificity here. So if we're looking at your mobility or flexibility of certain body parts, we want it always to be in relation to the movement you care about. So there's obviously a never-ending list of stretches or tests that we could do to test the range of motion for a given joint or muscle. But if we're worried about squatting, hamstrings are involved in squatting, but hamstring range of motion might not be the biggest factor as to why you have an imbalance left or right. It could be a factor, but what we want to think about here are the usual suspects for major working muscles in the movement, and um, and focus our attention on those. So if we're looking at a squat, we're thinking glutes, quads, groin adductors, and calves as the usual suspects, maybe even lower back as well. And super simple, just assess their range of motion in a squat like position, compare left and right. If there's a major difference, then that's a big clue that something's different from one side to the other. And if it's causing pain, injury, or you're hitting a performance plateau, then it's potentially something to look at.
Yeah, I think like as you've said before, like when we've spoken about in other episodes, where mobility is only an issue if you then can't perform anymore. So,
Yeah.
like, if for instance in a back squat you're hitting depth and your knees aren't going over the toes necessarily, like that's not going to be an issue if your standards in your competition that you're doing are met. So
Yeah.
this is where then obviously when you're thinking about going beyond and beyond the actual competition, like we alluded to earlier, where your right side might work more than your left, but that's what you want in competition because you want to produce a maximal amount of force to create the best scenario for you. But when we're
Mm.
coming back out of that, this is the opportunity then to start thinking deeper than that.
Yeah. What are you optimizing for is the question. Like, are you optimizing for range of motion
Yeah.
or are you optimizing for output performance? And that's a personal call, like
Yeah.
depending what you care about most.
Yeah. And I think at the moment, especially like as someone in the fitness industry, that it's very everyone's trying to optimize for everything at the moment. And it's like, and
Mm.
it's funny because then it's like people only have so much time in their day. So you really do have to be a lot more specific. But people promise you the world as saying like we're going to make you more mobile, more stable, more stronger, more this, more that, and you're just like that is probably the case, and you probably will get all of those things. But what are your expectations of how much more mobile are you going to be? How much stronger are you going to be? And I think having a test of some sort to see, okay, this I've got 0.5% better over the last 4 weeks. Perfect. Cool. I am moving in the right direction. I'm not quite as mobile as I thought I'd be, but how mobile are you going to be 4 weeks later compared to say, doing over say 8 compared to your whole lifetime before that? So it's just fascinating because it is like we talk about the specificity, and there's so much promise at the moment for everything, but it's because it's what people want. But you
Mm.
realize that, sorry, this is like a completely tangent. This is not on the notes.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about this and going into my little world. And it's like, it is, we want to offer everything because it's what everyone wants. But then the reality is you don't need everything. You need
Yeah.
to focus on one piece at a time to get the most out of it and kind of sprinkle in the other stuff along the way to kind of, you know, expose yourself to it.
Yeah. So like, I think my thoughts on that are basically if you prioritize everything, you prioritize nothing. So
Yeah.
if you think all of these things are equally important, then none of them is actually important. None of them actually carries significant weight. There has to be more and less important focuses for you to actually derive significant results in any area. You can, it's kind of like CrossFit programming is a good illustration of this.
Yeah.
In that if you work on everything at the same time, you can make some progress on everything at the same time. But if you focus on particular areas, those areas will develop at a greater rate than the other areas. And usually that results in greater results in the long term. But the degree to which you prioritize and deprioritize things is sort of the magic behind
It's the coach, isn't it? It's the skill.
yeah.
It's the skill of looking at what needs priority and what doesn't. And sorry, it's the tangent come because I'm looking at this and I was then thinking to myself, it's like, how would I prioritize the strength, the mobility, the stability, and the size in my own training right now? Like, what
Mm,
does that look like? So before we go off on that tangent, I think stability. Let's go dive into some stability stuff because
yeah.
stability can be a really hard thing to identify when you do most things bilaterally.
Yeah, exactly. And something you touched on earlier that we should say is that they're all interrelated. So strength, mobility, stability, and even size, they are all interrelated. They all do affect each other. So yeah, something we say at the training sim is everything's everything. So there's always, if we think about that single leg step down assessment, there is an element of strength, there's an element of mobility, and there's an element of stability. Even in a barbell back squat, which we perceive as a very stable exercise, there's still an element of stability. So if you're incredibly unstable, that will impact your ability to express strength and also to express mobility. So we in these assessments, we're biasing one of these movement qualities, but we're never fully isolating it because it's actually less relevant if it's fully isolated. If you're like lying on a bed and somebody tests your hamstring length, it's very different to being able to do a forward fold and touch your toes. Like they're
Yeah.
not the same. So it's just important to caveat that. But in terms of stability, if you are unstable, it's going to greatly diminish your ability to express mobility and strength. Essentially, think of stability as balance, your ability to control and stabilize. I don't like to use the same word to define it. A movement. So, how well can you deviate from your center point and return with good control, and how quickly can you correct those deviations. So nice way to visualize this is if you think about somebody who's incredible at handstands, they look like they're still, but if you go up really close to them, you'll see their hands are like vibrating. They're basically trembling because they're detecting an overbalance in one direction and correcting it in a fraction of a millimeter.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at somebody who's just developed handstands, those wobbles are much bigger because they need to go further from center before they can feel it and then correct it. And that essentially is the skill of stability and balance. So if we're assessing stability in relation to a target movement, like a back squat, like running, we want to pick an assessment exercise which replicates the demands. So that step down would be a great stability assessment as well for squatting. We can bias the direction with which you need to stabilize by adding a reach or something like that. But at its simplest, balance exercises. So reverse lunges, slow motion reverse lunges to increase the control demand would be a great one for squatting. And if we're looking at something like running, we want to add in the locomotive component. So walking lunges or even hopping gives us a great ability to compare left and right. If you get somebody to hop 20 meters on one leg and then the other, you can look at their body position. You can look at how far left and right the hops go, how long the hops are as well. So we're assessing multiple things at the same time, but primarily we can assess their ability to control those ground reactions as the foot hits the floor.
Nice. And I guess our last point of size, and this one for me it's quite fascinating because it's not always where you think. And the reason what I mean by this is like, so we found out prior to this call that basically we're like opposites, is in like, so like my left bicep is smaller than my right bicep, but my left bicep is stronger than my right bicep. So the illusion would be, because my right side is bigger, that it would be stronger. But it's actually the opposite, and you're the opposite to that, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So it's like, for me, it's just, that's a really interesting thought that you might think one thing, but the actual reality isn't. And it just then shows that it might be giving you a clue as to understand if it can do more work, essentially. But reality is, when I'm doing a left bicep curl with a dumbbell, say, it's all good. It's completely fine. Whereas do that to my right, it fatigues quicker as well. It's fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the way I think about size is that, like you said there, it gives you a clue, but you need to be a little bit open-minded. It's not necessarily that the bigger side is doing more work or is stronger or anything like that. There's a few possible explanations. The obvious connection is, yeah, the bigger muscle does more, and that does tend to be true, but it isn't always true. It might be bigger because it's less efficient. So actually it is under tension more than the more efficient side. So we know time under tension is a stimulus for hypertrophy. So you might actually have a bigger arm because of its inefficiency rather than
Yeah.
because of its strength, which is quite funny. But when you're looking at somebody, you can quite often see some clues, like one quad might be bigger, one glute might be bigger, and that gives you an idea as to where force might be going or where inefficiency might be.
Yeah, and I think for me as well, when it does come to like the size principle stuff, where it doesn't really matter unless you are competing in bodybuilding, where it is the sole matter of everything because you are being judged based on symmetry. Like generally, like if they both function well and like whatever side, then there's no injuries, no nothing. The fact that one side is bigger than the other is just, it is what it is, right? And I think when I remember going back to my bodybuilding days, how I remember trying to think, I need to bring up my left side, and I would do more curls on my left side, and for a full like good amount of time, and I just never saw any real change. And I never understood why. And did I just not do enough? Like I would say to always do. It was, I remember say with curls, because it was for me, curls and my left side of my chest. It seems to be my left side of my body is just smaller than my right side. And I've just realised that. I would do chest press machine. So plate loaded on my left side only. So I wouldn't do chest press machine with both sides most of the time. I'd always only use it on my left. And on my curls, I'd do an extra set. I'd always have an extra set on my left side. So maybe I just didn't do enough volume over the years, but it never changed. So yeah.
Yeah. I think that's probably it, mate. We'll get onto that. The simple fixes.
Yeah.
Before we do, though, one other thing, just a basic thing to check. We've obviously talked about the limbs, left and right limbs, but we also need to consider our trunk and core. There's only one of those. So how can it be different left and right? It can be different in side bending and rotation. So because we are one-sided beings, we generally prefer one side, especially if you play a one-sided sport like a racket sport or rowing, the classic examples, or hockey. You tend to lean to one side and rotate to one side more than the other. So we just want to do basic assessments of range of motion and control. Can you side bend further one way than the other? Can you rotate one way further than the other? If there is a major difference, this is obviously something we might want to look into. The other telltale signs is if you rotate one way, you might find it actually makes you breathless because your rib cage compresses. It doesn't like going into that rotation. So that's a big clue that you don't like one rotation versus the other. So now we've established some simple ways to identify left-right imbalances or trunk and core imbalances. We're going to get into the simple fixes. And as Rob just mentioned there, the easiest thing, the most simple thing is do more of whatever that missing movement quality is. So if it's a size discrepancy, we want to do more hypertrophy work if you're a bodybuilder and symmetrical aesthetics are important to you. And I think my thoughts on this are that people don't go aggressive enough. If you're trying to even out an imbalance, double or triple the amount of work is not a bad idea. And people feel freaked out to train so asymmetrically. But at the end of the day, if there is a significant difference between left and right, you need to train significantly differently from left to right. So rather than doing just one extra set, if you're doing 4 or 5 sets, that's a very small percentage of extra work on the weak side. So doing double would be the way I would go about it. And we've talked about this previously before about how you might structure that. Like I would think of it as like a 3-set cluster. So if you're doing double reps, you can do, say your left is the weak side or the side that needs more work. You would do left, right, left, rest, left, right, left, rest. So in every little cluster of 3 sets, you're doing twice the amount, but the left doesn't have to do double the work at any one time. So it's a little bit easier to tolerate.
Yeah. I mean, it's that when I say I look back on this, 8-10 years ago, like I understand that I clearly didn't do enough. Otherwise, how all these bodybuilders doing it? So that the people that is their sole focus. So I clearly didn't do enough to bring up. But then again, that also then comes down to the reality of, did it matter enough to me? And that is the crux of it, right? Because it didn't affect my performance per se that I noticed. It didn't really cause me any issues in any of my power lifts, which has kind of been a staple over the years. That's kind of always been a foundation of whether I've been doing bodybuilding, CrossFit, triathlon, whatever. I've always kind of done the fundamentals of the main 3 lifts, and they've never really been impacted by the size of my left bicep or my left chest. You know what I mean? They just haven't. And it's like, but the left chest potentially, say with the lockout on the left side, but I think that's more actually to do with my right side. Just some shoulder issue there. But so it is interesting, but that you say, obviously, you just feel uneasy doing, say, 20 reps on your left, but only 10 on your right. You're like, this is not right. The world's going to end. This is going to not.
OCD triggered.
Yeah, it's just it's an open loop, and it's just like, but I think when it comes to then other things, like going into more like the strength and performance side of stuff, I think when having clear tests, having a definition of what is my left strength, what is my right strength, and what am I going to do to improve that, and then how can I remeasure that down the line. And obviously we've spoken about here doing like the floating step downs and stuff like that, but you could use split squats as an example and try to have like a real focus on, right, I'm going to make sure I'm not pushing down into my left leg, and that does come a little bit more honest. So then it's how much did you give, and only you know that. So same as like when I do assisted pull-ups with people, and I get them doing self-assisted where their feet are on the floor. I'm like, I love it as an exercise because it's very close to the movement, but I
Yeah.
don't like it as a coach because I don't know how much they're giving themselves on that day.
Yeah.
So I obviously can scale that accordingly to kind of get a bit of a clue, but it is a lot more on you, and it adds more honesty into your way of training.
Yeah, big time. And I think that principle of retesting and reassessing is super important for all these different types of difference we could see. You want to be checking in to see if the intervention you've applied is making a difference. So if you're doing some extra strength work, if you're doing some extra mobility, stability, or hypertrophy work, check in regularly to see if it's working. And if it's not, you need to change something. It might be as simple as just doing more. So going from double reps to triple reps to see if it can catch up, or maybe there's something more complex going on. But something we say for all of our coaching, training, programming discussions, you need to have some metrics by which to evaluate your progress. So it could be as simple as performance in a given exercise, or it could be nuanced movement quality, but you have to be checking in. Otherwise, you're just guessing as to whether it's making a difference or not.
Yeah, and quick caveat: don't go from doing 1-to-1 to 3-to-1 on your biceps or whatever you're doing. Don't just jump to doing triple the reps, because you will get tendonitis in the elbow. You will get shoulder issues because you've then just done double or triple the amount of work suddenly on your weaker potential side. So
Yeah.
you need to dose this appropriately and think, okay, cool. You can have an honest look at yourself. Maybe if you're doing it aesthetically or if you're doing performance based, say, right, what is the deal? As we say, you've got your metric of where you are, and you say, right, okay, now let's get a plan in place. Obviously, this is what we do when we coach, but let's get a plan in place over the next 12 weeks to say, double up that work, or say over the next 6 weeks to double it up, have a retest, then cool, okay, it's not working yet, so let's now add a little bit more into that and go a little bit more towards triple. By the end of 12 weeks, okay, cool, this seems to be working, that left is now catching up, let's stick with this for a bit, and then you can then still, cool, can I actually now taper back a little bit of that work, because now one's actually caught up with the other one. Just because you go 3-to-1 for a period of time doesn't mean you need to stay there. So
Yeah.
just remember that.
Really important point. Yeah, thanks, Rob. It's the principles of progressive overload still apply. So if you're trying to catch up that weak left side, it doesn't mean you can exceed the rule of thumb of 10%.
Yeah.
You can't go 300% instead of 10%. So the way I would think about this is go as fast as normally advised on the weak side, and then dial back the strong side, which again is difficult to do psychologically because you know the strong side has more, but you're going to have to rein that in to give the weak side a chance to catch up. If it's the right side, right strong side is racing away, it will never catch up. So you have to slow it down and appreciate the maximum rate of recovery in the weak side. Like you can't just arbitrarily triple the work, like Rob said. You have to respect progressive overload and go at a sensible rate of progression in the weak side to address that imbalance.
Do you know what? This has given me inspiration, right, to do an experiment. So I'm gonna using that, and because I'm prepping for a powerlifting competition, so I'm not prepping for size, but I am taking on plenty of protein, and I am training essentially in a manner which will produce size and strength. So rather than doubling up my bicep work and essentially causing potentially other issues on my deadlift and so forth, what I'm going to do is actually drop my right-sided volume down and bring it and keep my left side the same. So if I've got 4 sets of 8 to 12, I'm going to do 2 sets of 8 to 12 on my right and 4 sets of 8 to 12 on my left. And I'll see. So this will be a little test. So December the 3rd is my test, my performance test. So it's a good 12 weeks away nearly, roughly. So yeah, it'll be cool. So we can see, does this actually work?
There you go. There you go, mate.
So takeaways, I think our number one takeaway today is it's very natural and normal to be not symmetrical. So asymmetry is normal. It's not a problem unless it is a problem. So, if I love those type of things, but if you start getting an injury or you start to feel a niggle, the niggle, as we've gone discussing our niggle and injury episode, the niggle is the indication that something's going to start to go wrong. That's your problem becoming a problem. So definitely start thinking about that. And then, as we just alluded to there, test your strength, your control and range of motion, and size differences, and then see what plans you can put in place to kind of rectify them if you need to, and if it's a priority for you to. And don't be shy to hammer one side. That doesn't mean then double, triple the work on that one side. It might mean actually taper back on the other side. And that's something that I've not thought about before, is actually just tapering it down on my right side and just keeping my left side as it is. So I'm a little bit scared to lose all my right bicep veins, but we'll see. So,
Okay, mate.
guys, if you did enjoy today's episode, we would love to hear from you. And if you think, I'm a bit of an unbalanced individual and this has helped you, we would love to hear from that even more as well, because we love to hear things that we are saying are actually, hitting home in people and helping to improve their full training and fitness lifestyle stuff. So thank you very much as always for your time. Really appreciate it. And we will see you next week.
Thanks, guys.